In just 38 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved comedians went from laughing guest to furious enemy, tearing into the host with accusations that left the studio audience gasping. What started as friendly banter exploded into a full-blown war of words that ended with Ricky Gervais storming off set, leaving Jonathan Ross speechless and the crew scrambling. Before we dive into this explosive showdown, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals. Hit that bell icon so you never miss the drama. Last night's episode of The Jonathan Ross Show was supposed to be another cozy chat between two old friends. Ricky Gervais was there to promote his latest Netflix special, and everyone expected the usual back and forth. The jokes, the laughs, maybe a cheeky story or two. The studio audience settled into their seats, ready for entertainment. The cameras rolled. Jonathan Ross walked out to applause, grinning that trademark grin, his hair perfectly styled as always. He made a few warm-up jokes, got the crowd laughing, and then introduced his first guest of the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, he's one of the funniest men on the planet, creator of The Office, a comedy genius, and someone I'm privileged to call a friend. Please welcome Ricky Gervais. The audience erupted as Ricky walked onto the stage, waving and smiling. He wore his usual casual outfit, jeans and a dark shirt, looking relaxed. The two men hugged briefly, and Ricky settled into the guest chair. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Jonathan started with the expected questions about the new special, about Ricky's recent projects, about his life. Ricky answered with his characteristic confidence, throwing in jokes that had the audience roaring. They talked about his dog, about his partner Jane, about his atheism. Standard stuff. Comfortable territory. But then Jonathan shifted gears. So Ricky, I've got to ask you about something, Jonathan said, leaning forward slightly. You've been quite vocal recently about certain issues, haven't you? Trans issues, particularly. The audience went quieter. Ricky's expression didn't change much, but there was a slight tightening around his eyes. I've talked about a lot of things, Jonathan, Ricky replied carefully. I talk about everything. That's what comedians do. Yes, but this particular topic, Jonathan pressed. You've received quite a bit of criticism for some of your jokes. Some people have called them offensive, even harmful. What do you say to that? Ricky shifted in his seat. I say that comedy is supposed to push boundaries. It's supposed to make people uncomfortable sometimes. If you can't joke about something, then you can't talk about it. And if you can't talk about it, you can't think about it properly. Jonathan nodded. But there was something in his tone that felt different now. Less friendly, more interrogative. But there's a difference between pushing boundaries and punching down, isn't there? Jonathan said. When you're someone with your platform, your influence, making jokes about a marginalized community, some would argue that's not brave. It's just cruel. The temperature in the studio shifted. You could feel it. The audience members exchanged glances. This wasn't the playful banter they'd come for. Ricky's jaw tightened. Hold on. Are you seriously lecturing me about comedy right now? You, Jonathan Ross, are going to tell me what's acceptable to joke about? I'm not lecturing anyone, Jonathan replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender, but his smile had an edge to it now. I'm just asking the question that a lot of people want answered. You've built your career on being provocative, but maybe you've crossed a line this time. Crossed a line? Ricky repeated, his voice rising slightly. What line? The line that you've decided exists? The line that changes every 5 minutes depending on who's shouting the loudest on Twitter? Jonathan laughed, but it wasn't genuine. It was the laugh of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away. Come on, Ricky. You know what I mean. There are real people affected by this rhetoric. Trans people who are already facing discrimination, violence, harassment. And when someone with your profile makes jokes at their expense, it emboldens the people who want to hurt them. Ricky leaned forward now, his eyes locked on Jonathan's. That's absolute rubbish. And you know it, Ricky said firmly. I've never made a joke at anyone's expense who didn't deserve it. I make fun of everyone, including myself. That's equality, Jonathan. True equality means everyone gets the same treatment. You don't get special protection just because you claim victim status. The audience was completely silent now. This had gone from entertainment to something else entirely. Something uncomfortable. Something real. Jonathan's expression hardened. Special protection? Ricky, these are people who are being attacked, who are killing themselves at alarming rates. This isn't about victim status. It's about basic human decency. Don't you dare, Ricky said, his voice low and dangerous now. Don't you dare use suicide statistics to win an argument. That's the lowest form of emotional manipulation, and you bloody well know it. Jonathan sat back, his face flushing slightly. I'm not manipulating anything. I'm stating facts. You're stating facts that you think give you moral authority, Ricky shot back. You're trying to paint me as some kind of monster because I made jokes. Jokes, Jonathan. Words. Comedy. Remember comedy? That thing we both do for a living? Comedy that punches down isn't comedy, Jonathan said, his voice getting louder. It's bullying. That was the moment. That was when the conversation crossed from heated debate into something darker. Ricky stood up. I'm not doing this, he said, pulling off his microphone. I'm not sitting here and being accused of bullying by someone who built his career on taking the piss out of everyone and everything. Jonathan stood up too, trying to regain control. Ricky, come on, sit down. We're just having a conversation. A conversation? Ricky barked out a laugh. This is an ambush. You invited me here to promote my work, and instead you're trying to crucify me for the woke mob. Well, bollocks to that. The audience gasped. Some people pulled out their phones, filming. The producers in the control room were probably losing their minds. Jonathan's face was red now, his composure cracking. Maybe if you'd just listen for once instead of being so bloody arrogant. Arrogant? Ricky interrupted, his voice echoing through the studio. You're calling me arrogant? You, Jonathan Ross, the man who thinks he's the arbiter of what's acceptable? The man who's kissed every celebrity arse that's walked through that door? You're going to lecture me about arrogance? At least I don't make a career out of offending people, Jonathan shouted back. No, you make a career out of being a coward, Ricky roared. You sit there in your comfortable chair, asking your safe questions, never taking a real risk, never saying anything that might upset your precious BBC overlords or your Twitter followers. You're a puppet, Jonathan. A well-paid, perfectly coiffed puppet. The studio was in chaos now. The audience didn't know whether to clap, boo, or stay silent. Some were filming everything on their phones. Others were looking around nervously, wondering if they should leave. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the meltdown. Jonathan's hands were shaking. Whether from anger or shock, it was hard to tell. Get off my show, he said quietly. What? Ricky said, even though he'd clearly heard. I said get off my show, Jonathan repeated, louder this time. If you're going to stand there and insult me, insult everything I do, then you can leave. Get out. Ricky laughed, but there was no humor in it. Gladly. I wouldn't want to spend another second on this pathetic excuse for a talk show anyway. But Jonathan wasn't done. Something in him snapped. All the years of playing nice, of being the friendly host, of smiling through awkward moments, it all came pouring out. You know what your problem is, Ricky? Jonathan said, stepping closer. You think being offensive makes you brave. You think being controversial makes you important. But really, you're just a bitter old man who's terrified of becoming irrelevant. So you say shocking things to get attention, and you wrap it up in this pretense of defending free speech. But we all see through it. We all know you're just a bully who's run out of original ideas. The words hung in the air like poison. The audience gasped again. This had gone too far. Way too far. Ricky stood perfectly still for a moment, staring at Jonathan with an expression that was hard to read. Hurt? Fury? Disgust? Maybe all three. You know what, Jonathan? Ricky said, his voice suddenly calm. Dangerously calm. I came here tonight thinking we were mates. I've known you for years. We've shared drinks. We've shared laughs. We've shared stages. And I thought, despite everything, despite the fact that you've turned into this sanctimonious prick, I thought we still had respect for each other. But I was wrong. Ricky, Jonathan started. But Ricky held up a hand. No, let me finish. You just called me a bully. You called me a bitter old man. You questioned my integrity, my talent, my motivations. And you did it in front of all these people, in front of cameras, knowing it would be broadcast to millions. And why? Because I make jokes you don't approve of? Because I don't bow down to the same ideology you've decided to embrace? Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Ricky wasn't having it. You're not brave, Jonathan. You're a coward. A coward who attacks people under the guise of defending others. You hide behind your concern for marginalized groups, but really, you just want to feel superior. You want to be on the right side of history, or whatever the hell that means. But you know what? History doesn't care about talk show hosts who played it safe. History remembers the people who had the balls to say what they thought. Even when everyone else was screaming at them to shut up, the studio was dead silent. Every eye was on the two men facing each other on stage. Jonathan's face was twisted with anger and something else. Shame, maybe. Or fear. Fear that Ricky was right. I think you should leave now, Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Oh, I'm leaving, Ricky said. But not because you told me to. I'm leaving because I can't stand being in the same room as you for another second. You've changed, Jonathan. Or maybe you haven't. Maybe you were always like this, and I was just too stupid to see it. Ricky turned to the audience. Sorry you had to witness this, folks. This wasn't what any of us signed up for tonight. But sometimes you find out who people really are when they're challenged. And tonight, we found out exactly who Jonathan Ross is. He dropped his microphone on the floor, the sound echoing through the studio like a gunshot. Then he walked toward the exit, his footsteps loud in the silence. But Jonathan couldn't let it end there. His pride wouldn't allow it. That's right, run away, Jonathan shouted after him. Run away like you always do when someone calls you out. You can't handle criticism, can you? You can dish it out, but you can't take it. Ricky stopped. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around, might come back and really let Jonathan have it. The audience held its breath. The camera zoomed in, but Ricky didn't turn around. Instead, he raised his middle finger high in the air, without looking back, and kept walking. He pushed through the studio doors and disappeared into the corridor beyond. The doors swung shut behind him with a heavy thud. Jonathan stood alone on the stage, breathing hard, his face flushed, his hands trembling. The audience didn't know what to do. A few people started clapping uncertainly. Others sat in stunned silence. Some were still filming on their phones, knowing they'd just witnessed something that would be all over social media within minutes. Jonathan looked at the cameras, then at the audience, then back at the cameras. He seemed lost, like he didn't know what to say or do next. His carefully constructed persona had crumbled in a matter of minutes. Right, he finally said, his voice shaky. Well, that was unexpected. Nobody laughed. Nobody responded. The atmosphere was thick with discomfort. One of the producers rushed onto the stage, whispering urgently in Jonathan's ear. He nodded, not really listening, still staring at the doors Ricky had exited through. The show had completely derailed. There was no coming back from this. No amount of jokes or charm could smooth over what had just happened. Jonathan Ross and Ricky Gervais, two of Britain's most famous comedians, had just torn each other apart on live television. Or pre-recorded television that would air later. But still, the damage was done. Jonathan tried to compose himself. We're going to take a quick break, he announced to the audience, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. We'll be right back. The second the cameras stopped rolling, chaos erupted. Producers rushed the stage. Audience members started talking all at once, their voices rising in excitement and shock. People were already tweeting, posting to Instagram, sharing clips. Within minutes, the confrontation would be everywhere. Trending worldwide, dissected and analyzed and argued over by millions of people who all thought they knew exactly who was right and who was wrong. But in that moment, in the studio, all anyone could think about was what they'd just witnessed. A friendship destroyed. A professional relationship shattered. Two men who had once laughed together now couldn't stand to be in the same room. Jonathan sat back down in his chair, ignoring the producers trying to talk to him. He looked older suddenly, tired. The confidence and charm that usually radiated from him had vanished. Backstage, Ricky was already gone. He'd walked straight out of the building, not stopping to talk to anyone, not pausing to remove his makeup or collect his things. He just left. His publicist tried to follow him, tried to get him to stay and do damage control, but Ricky ignored her. He got into his car and drove away, leaving everyone else to deal with the aftermath. Back in the studio, the audience was being ushered out. The rest of the show was canceled. There was no point in continuing. Nobody would remember anything else that happened tonight anyway. This confrontation would be the only thing anyone talked about. As the studio emptied, Jonathan remained in his chair, staring at nothing. One of his longtime producers approached him carefully. "Jonathan," she said gently, "we need to talk about what happens next." Jonathan nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He was replaying the argument in his head, thinking about everything that had been said. The accusations, the insults, the fury in Ricky's eyes. Had he gone too far? Had he pushed too hard? He'd known Ricky would defend himself, of course. Ricky always defended himself. But Jonathan hadn't expected the full force of Ricky's anger to be directed at him personally. He'd thought he could challenge Ricky's views, could get him to see reason, could maybe even score some points with the audience, who agreed that Ricky had crossed lines recently. Instead, he'd been eviscerated, called a coward, called a puppet, accused of hiding behind fake concern and moral superiority. And the worst part? Deep down, in a place Jonathan didn't want to examine too closely, he wondered if Ricky was right. The studio lights started shutting off one by one, leaving pools of shadow across the stage. The crew packed up equipment, speaking in hushed tones, everyone aware they'd been part of something that would be talked about for years. Jonathan finally stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked slowly toward his dressing room, alone, while all around him people were already making phone calls, sending messages, preparing statements. The machine was in motion. Damage control had begun, but none of it mattered. None of the statements or apologies or explanations would change what had happened. In 38 seconds, a conversation had turned into a confrontation, and in the minutes that followed, two of Britain's biggest stars had revealed exactly who they were when the masks came off. The Jonathan Ross Show would air in a few days, and when it did, millions would watch the argument unfold. They would pick sides. They would tweet their hot takes. They would argue in comment sections and over dinner tables. Some would defend Ricky. Others would defend Jonathan. Most would just be entertained by the spectacle of it all. But tonight, in that empty studio with the lights going dark and the doors swinging shut, there were no winners. Just two angry men who had said things they couldn't take back, driven by pride and principle and the desperate need to be right. The doors closed. The lights went out. And somewhere in London, both Jonathan Ross and Ricky Gervais were alone, thinking about what had just happened, wondering if it had been worth it.